Thanks, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate a chance to come over to the Reagan Institute and talk about education policy. And I know this is a place where a lot of conversations about bipartisan common ground and solutions have been formed. And that's really been a driving force of so much of the improvement we've seen in education policy in recent decades. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. From the perspective of the Biden administration, there's really essential to have colleges and universities. And when you think about the problems that our country faces, whether it is economic growth, shared opportunity, racial equity, efforts to understand one another across partisan lines, to tackle great scientific challenges like pandemics and climate change, it's hard to imagine accomplishing any of those goals without contributions from colleges and universities and trade schools and other parts of our higher education system. So the question really is, how do we try and take advantage of the great potential of these institutions to solve our country's problems? And the good news is that we have seen tremendous progress in recent decades. Over the last 10 years, we've seen the college completion rate rise by 8 percentage points. It is still too low, but we are producing hundreds of thousands of additional graduates every year because we've learned a lot about how to help students succeed in college, how to help students with academic gaps, with financial needs, with other types of challenges succeed at higher standards. And that includes setting higher expectations. That includes creating a culture of belonging and providing them with the advice they need to find their way. It includes using data to look not for silver bullets, but to look for systemic solutions and steady improvement and try and help colleges get better and better over time. So the Biden administration is going to continue to try and invest in community colleges, in historically black colleges and universities, and other places that are really committed to serving an inclusive student population and helping them go on to a better life. I think the second major pillar of the Biden agenda is looking at the challenge of student debt. And we saw, even before the student loan pause, student loans being something that our students rely on. More students are borrowing, they're borrowing higher amounts. For some of us, like me, it created opportunities we otherwise might not have had, and we went on to benefit from a great education and the opportunities that come from it. But we've also seen a lot of young people struggling with their debts, delaying home ownership, making it more challenging to start a small business. We saw before the pause 1 million students a year defaulting on their loans. We saw typical black borrowers not paying off their balance, 10 years later owing as much as they borrowed. So there are fundamental challenges with our student loan program. We're working very hard to get students who need relief. Of course, there's a case at the Supreme Court for giving up to $20,000 in student loan debt. We've been working very hard to make the forgiveness programs live up to their potential. So we've taken the number of students getting public service loan forgiveness, for example, from 7,000 to more than 600,000 in 2 years. And that's by trying to strengthen the implementation of these programs, trying to reach people who are already eligible for those benefits, and trying to move them through our process. So all of this is about how do we take advantage of the potential of our colleges and universities, these incredible assets that we have in our country, and how do we take advantage of them to promote upward mobility, to drive economic growth, and to meet the other challenges that our country faces. So I'm delighted that Cheryl's going to be coming up, and we'll have a chance to have a little more conversation about these and other issues. Thank you.
This is such a treat for me, and I'm gonna reveal my age by saying about 20 years ago, I was working for the undersecretary, the first undersecretary that was focused on higher education. It was the Bush administration, and Secretary Spellings had just sort of reorganized the department and made it such that the deputy was focused on K-12 and the under was focused on higher education. So as a bit of a policy nerd, this is really a treat and so fun to be here with James. So thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl.
We're here, many of us talking about this, the 40 years, Nation at Risk. That's why we're all have sort of been gathered here today. And obviously you're a post-secondary education expert, and that's where you're focused and that's what you lead. But if you don't mind taking a second and thinking about, we've grown up under the last, 40 years of a nation at risk. When you think about the pillars of equity and excellence, how do you think that what are some of the, the highlights of, where we've done well over the past 40 years?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. There's something maybe about human nature where we don't pay a lot of attention to the slow positive changes over time. And the reality is we have seen a lot of progress over the last 40 years. Students are learning a lot more. We have more students graduating from high school. We have more students going to college. Having gone to college, they're more likely to graduate. And I think we have learned a lot about what it means to say that this education system should be open to everyone, that everyone should be learning to high expectations. And I think that in and of itself is a major culture change that is probably more important than any single policy. And I think we've learned, too, that improvement is not about silver bullets. It's not about after-school programs or small schools, but it's about trying to measure where students are succeeding, where they're getting stuck, and trying to incrementally improve year over year.
Where do you think we've had the biggest challenge or the biggest failure in the last 40 years? Where have we not, the last two speakers, both Governor Hutchinson and Governor Moore, said they thought we were still a nation at risk?
Well, I think we still have very large equity gaps by race and by income. And there's a lot of room for us to improve there. That's true at the K-12 level, and it's certainly true in the higher education system. Our colleges and universities as a whole, fewer than half of students of color graduate within 6 years. Student debt has big racial components. Obviously, we're coming through the pandemic, and that has created big learning gaps for a lot of students, equivalent to many months of school. So I think a determined effort to try and accelerate that learning and close those gaps is urgently needed. It's one that could be a positive legacy of these very difficult years that we've all lived through if we pay attention to the need for tutoring and other personalized learning, the need for extended learning time, and try to figure out how do we help all students learn faster and how do we close equity gaps.
Yeah. I have so many questions. I want to pivot to post-secondary. I have so many questions, and we're probably not going to get through them all. But I was in the Bush administration during the Spellings Commission, and we, I think, sort of began a much more sort of focused consideration of post-secondary education and how it impacts all the things that you were just talking about. You all have really had a focus in this administration on some really key issues. We've got, as you mentioned, a couple before the Supreme Court right now, affirmative action, the debt relief piece. Can we talk a little bit about the student loan forgiveness piece?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So I think I think it's fair to say there's mixed feelings about the debt relief piece, and I think I'm very interested in understanding, how are we really going to get at the issue of cost in higher education? And it feels like this doesn't really get to the underlying issues, and maybe that's not the point. So just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, obviously we've been through a couple of unprecedented years, and as the Secretary is looking toward restarting student loan payments, he sees student debt relief as a really integral part of that strategy. I mentioned 1 million people a year defaulting prior to the pause. Now we've had a situation where people haven't been making payments for more than 3 years. I can't think of a parallel to that in any type of governmental or private sector experience. it's going to be tremendously challenging to help people return to repayment in a successful way. More broadly, we need to be thinking about permanent systemic solutions to the problem of student debt and student loans. For a long time, the federal government has run the program at cost. Obviously, they have no cost to states or to institutions. And so as college costs have risen, the Pell Grant value has declined, states have cut back, and the result has been higher tuition, higher borrowing, and more people struggling to repay their loans. So we need to be thinking about not just fixing on the back end the student loan program, but also investing in the education we want our young people to have, investing in Pell Grants, investing in free community college. And it also means, looking at where is all this unaffordable debt coming from? And it's not spread evenly. There are parts of the higher education system that leave more students with loans they can't afford. And what is the solution in those areas? And how do we make sure, are those good programs? And if they are good programs, how do we want to finance them?
So two things. I want to come back to the are they good programs piece and talk a little bit about quality. But I just want to dig in a little bit more on the student loan piece and what is the federal, what is the federal sort of contribution to exacerbating this, right? We have increased the amount you can borrow, I think, which then leads to more debt being taken out. And where's the institution's role to, I think there's a correlation between, okay, let's raise the amount you can borrow, and then tuition sometimes also increases.
Well, there's been a lot of research on that, and I think undergraduates have loan limits. They borrow $6,000 a year, more or less. We have allowed graduate students to borrow up to the full cost of attendance. And, that's a place where we see a lot of graduate students taking out loans that don't appear to be justified by their post-graduation earnings. So I think that is a difficult question we have to face. I think, another area that we see problems that's maybe not intuitive, but we see some of the most challenges on the smallest loans, because those are students who attended college for a semester or two. Oftentimes they'll set their loans aside, they'll go into default, interest fees will rack up, and they don't have the economic benefits of that education that they were expecting.
Yeah. What do we need to be doing on that some college, no degree piece?
Well, I think we all need to be working to make sure that higher education is not just a good investment on average, but it's also a reliable investment. And so that we can say to not just our young people, but also, working parents, displaced workers, people of all ages that, we think it's a good idea for you to go back to college, trade school, to earn more credentials, to help you get a job. But we're not going to let you be left worse off. If the investment doesn't pay off for some reason, you're not going to regret it. And, I talk to students who say going to college was the worst mistake of their lives. That's the exact opposite of the message we're trying to send to people. It's the exact opposite of, what we want. Our country would benefit from having many more people going from college. So we need to think about how do we reliably meet students' expectations so that they know what they're getting and they know it's a good investment.
How do you feel about the sort of narrative? We heard a little bit about it from the First Lady. Certainly, we all talk about it. Pathways, multiple pathways, which I think everybody is supportive of. And not everyone needs to go to college. I think the research still suggests that, by and large, earnings are better for college graduates. What do you think about it as somebody who's been deeply engaged in higher education for a long time? Do you worry about that? And what does that mean for certain demographics of individuals, low income, those least well served, I guess?
Yeah, well, I imagine the First Lady talked about her career-connected high schools. And I think, our system of education is tremendously diverse. It's a real strength that we have so many different options available to people, but it also can be very challenging to navigate. And so giving high school students some exposure to college, some exposure to what their career options are, even if they don't end up transferring those credits or building on that, it still can demystify the whole process. So we know that can have a big impact. And we need workers with all kinds of educational credentials. And if you're thinking about the industries of the future in clean energy and cybersecurity and healthcare, there will be a need for people with advanced degrees, but they're going to be working side by side with people with associate degrees and with certificates. So we have to respect all of these career choices and make them all possible and give students the guidance information they need to make these choices.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about accreditation a little bit, because I want to go back to the comment you made about quality. Or how do we know, you didn't say quality, you said how do we know these are good programs? And I think generally, if you're going to an institution that is accredited by an agency recognized by the Department of Education, that to the average consumer, hopefully, there's some assurances there of quality. And if there isn't, which there appears to be not, how do we either improve? Do we need to be thinking differently about accreditation? Do we need to be thinking differently about a quality assurance mechanism outside of accreditation? Sorry, that this feels really weedy, but I think it kind of gets to the heart of the matter of what's quality, what's not quality.
Yeah, well, going back even before the department got into financial aid, when we were talking about the GI Bill, we looked at how do we know that these resources are being spent for quality, and one of the indicators there was accreditation. I do think accreditation is important, having talked to a lot of college leaders. They see the accreditation process as a really important one for them to engage in scrutiny of how they're doing across a whole range of areas and to motivate their faculty around improvement. So I think it is true. It's also true that we've had some schools with very poor student outcomes who remain accredited, and I know, Cheryl, you did some thinking about that back in the days of the Spelling Commission.
Yeah.
I think that's a real question is, what does it mean for an institution to be accredited if their students are more likely to default on their student loan than they are to graduate? That's a challenge.
Yeah. And looking at those default rates, I feel like that's not going to be a real reliable measure if we've forgiven everybody's loans.
Well, I hope so. I mean, defaults are really where students get sort of ground up in the gears of the student loan program. These are not people who are beating the system. We have, it's not a good financial decision for anyone to try and skirt their student loan. We have lots of fees and wage garnishment and offsets, and you could lose your driver's license, you could lose your career license. So, these are overwhelmingly people that are struggling. They're former Pell recipients, they're first generation college, they're students of color. I think we do need to think about how do we make sure that we're keeping people out of default. And we need to collect student loans, but we shouldn't do it in a way that's punitive. Some of these things actually make it more difficult for students to repay their loans. Now, I think to your broader question, we do have to be thinking about measures of quality. Are students graduating, and does that degree bring the opportunities that they're expecting? For most, that's a job. Some people have other goals. But we need to be we need to find ways of saying, like, are you reliably taking a student and getting them where they're hoping to go?
Aside from, say, the college scorecard or just more transparency and data and outcomes, are there other things that we should be thinking about in terms of quality? I know I work at the Chamber of Commerce, and we have thought about what role the employers might play in some sort of a quality, signaling quality from an employer perspective. What else should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's critically important. And, employers, as you know, had a major role in reforming our K-12 schools, and had a tremendously beneficial impact on that conversation. It seems to me that there will be more and more pressure on the system to demonstrate exactly what our students are capable of doing. Employers are looking for skills-based hiring. Some colleges are looking at competency-based education. They seem to be speaking different languages. From the research, you can take it with however much grain of salt you want, but AI will be replacing some of the tasks that workers do. I think that's going to leave people wondering, what skills do I need to learn, and where do I learn those skills at a level that is more granular than our existing system of educational credentials. So I think it's urgent for employers and educators to sit down and say, can we find a Rosetta Stone here so that we're all working off of the same definitions about what people know, what they need to know, and how we're going to get them that knowledge.
Yeah. You mentioned, I totally blanked. Sorry, I was thinking, I guess you mentioned credit hours or competency-based education. How are you guys thinking about that at the Department of Education? Like, how can the federal government help to advance further competency-based education? How can we start to move a system to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more nimble, to keep up with the pace of change in jobs and skills and what is required? What are employers looking for? You mentioned AI, emerging technologies. We can't be educating folks on the technologies of 10 years ago, right? When it's just moving. And so it feels a little bit like the Higher Education Act, the system writ large is a little bit in the past, and we need to help it move quicker. And is there a role for the federal government in that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's clear that we're not going back to 2019. That when we moved everything online in a hurry, maybe Zoom isn't the right way to do it, but there are ways to use online and digital education tools to help students learn more, to learn faster. And there's a demand for it. This is something that students want. What I'm hearing is even students living in a dorm want a mixture of classes online. They want in-person classes, in-person experiences. So this is here to stay. And I think we do need a strategy for how do we help colleges and universities integrate these technologies into their teaching. And by and large, in many places, they're experimenting with online courses to serve a different population, to extend their reach. And that can be a good thing, but this is no longer becoming a on campus or online. It's digital everywhere. And we have to help colleges make that transition and take advantage of that potential.
What about the competency-based education piece and the credit hour, the seat time versus competencies? I mean, we've got great examples. I think Scott Pulsifleur will be on a panel later, and I'm sure can talk about the great work that they're doing. Is this a Department of Education issue? Like, do you need to regulate on this and let institutions move away from that, or?
Well, I'm interested in the conversation around it. I mean, we need an increment to know whether a student is full-time or part-time, so we know how much Pell Grant to give them. Our regulations are pretty flexible. There's, I think, a little bit of scapegoating around seat time, but if you look at what's required, it's really about the increment of learning that's traditionally represented by the credit hour. But it is still built fundamentally on a framework of semesters and credit hours, and so there is some rigidity in the foundations. I think it's worth looking at. I think it's worth looking at what can we do to make sure that we're helping colleges and universities and others innovate around getting people to their destinations as quickly as possible.
You've mentioned skills-based hiring. We talked, I think it came up a time or two in our discussion so far, but would love to dig into it just a little bit more. It's certainly something that it feels like there's a movement around it. And it also feels like it's a little bit of like, we just sort of throw it out there, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure everybody is working off the same definitions. People say they're doing it, employers say they're doing it, they want to move towards it, but it's really hard. And it also feels like a lot of people are conflating this idea of skills-based hiring means no more four-year degrees. And I don't think of it that way. I think we need to figure out how we're better able to, how the learner or the individual is better able to demonstrate what they know and are able to do. How do those credentials signal skills within them? And so then we can actually have a more skills-based system. Are you all thinking about that at all, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's a really important conversation. And, I think skills-based hiring is a really promising avenue. It can open up opportunities for people by removing arbitrary barriers. And I don't think it's something that higher education should shy away from, because someone is going to need to be providing those skills. We do have a system set up already. It's nationwide. It's got 20 million people in it. It's gonna play some role in
Right.
Getting people the preparation they need for their careers and their lives. But I do think, the challenge of defining and measuring those competencies is really very substantial. I think that's particularly true if you think those competencies are going to shift as technology advances. Like, we're probably better at measuring content knowledge, for example, than we are at active listening and empathy and communication skills. So I think there's a great deal of work to do there, but I think it's time to do it. There's going to be a lot of payoff.
Yeah. I want to circle back to student loans for just a second, because both of the previous two conversations talked about service and service to our nation, and Governor Moore has an initiative in Maryland.
Right.
In a new department, and Governor Hutchinson talked about it as well. And you mentioned public service loan forgiveness. And is there something we need to be doing to, is it an issue of people don't know about it? Or, is it a PR issue, or?
Yeah, it's a great question. We found that not just public service loan forgiveness, but across the board, people were struggling to navigate our
The
programs.
system. Got it.
So, we had, for example, 350,000 people who were eligible to have their loans discharged because they had total disabilities. We knew that they had total disabilities because that had been adjudicated by the Social Security Administration. Our definition aligned to theirs. But they weren't able to navigate our paperwork. They had to file a form every year for a number of years. And so they were in default. In some cases, they were in default, and we were garnishing their disability insurance when the fact that they were getting disability insurance meant that they were eligible to have their loans forgiven.
Jeez. Yeah.
So there's just like a lot of examples of, poor execution on what was a noble intention or a well-designed policy. Public service loan forgiveness was a sweeping promise made by Congress that a lot of people planned their careers around. But it turned out, you had to have a certain type of loan, you had to be in the right repayment plan, there was sort of a lot of other fine print.
Got it.
And if people filed the right form at the right point in time, they would get it. But it was just very difficult to navigate.
And you're working on that now?
We're working on it, yes. Yes.
How many loan forgiveness programs are there at the federal level?
Well, we are primarily focused on the pandemic-related programs, and then public service loan forgiveness, the total and permanent disability, and then we have some programs for people who were cheated by a for-profit college or whose college closed on them abruptly. So those are our main areas of focus. And with respect to public service loan forgiveness, we're looking at doing data matches with other federal agencies, so we can automatically credit people with public service, and then once we have that up and running, we can think about are there other public service employees. Because I think, certainly for us, I imagine across government, across businesses too, like, stuff is just very, very complicated to navigate. It's hard. I tried rolling over my IRA 6 months later, I'm still at it. And this stuff is hard to do, and we need to make it, people are busy.
Yeah.
They don't have time to decode all these things, so we need to make it as easy as possible for them.
And you're running basically a big bank over there.
Yeah, right.
It's not nothing.
Right.
We don't have a ton of time left, but I would love to ask you if you don't mind sort of telling us what you're thinking about or where you guys are headed in terms of, do you think something's going to happen on HEA on the Hill? Is this something you guys are, focused on? Are you going to be pushing them to do it? It's been some time since we've had
it has.
a reauthorization. What do you think?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think that if you could clear up all the atmospherics around it and start talking policy, I think you could agree a lot on, Pell for workforce programs and TRIO and Gear Up and simplifying programs and, many other things.
Yeah.
So I think there is a lot of common ground. It's a difficult environment right now, but I hope so. I know there's been some good conversations specifically around the workforce Pell issue.
Yeah.
And that might be a start to something promising.
And you've got the CTE programs under you,
We
right?
do, yeah. Yeah, those are, I think the career-connected high schools is something that could have broad appeal.
What can we do to help you, or what can the federal government do to sort of break down some silos? I mean, every time I turn around, there's a new workforce program that Congress is creating through some piece of legislation somewhere. And we've got Department of Labor, we've got Department of Education. It feels like we need some coordinated vision here.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, we have in the Career Technical Office some waiver authority that is interagency. Performance pilot partnerships. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to pull out the acronym.
Ooh, okay.
But it gives us ability to say to the field, how are these programs working together?
Okay.
So, for example, if you have a homeless youth and if you give him mental health services through Medicaid, he loses eligibility for his housing. Like those kinds of problems happen when our agencies are not well coordinated. And, they're often honestly more visible from the local level where the people are trying to put these things together than here where we're all sort of in our office sort of running in our lanes. But I think it would be worth, if there are ideas about how we can use that authority to better coordinate training programs around trying to achieve specific outcomes, I think that could be a really promising conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we are, the session has ended.
We're getting the hook.
We
Thanks
do
so
get
much.
the hook.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, James.